I think his corner would have let him die. At what point in time was he even remotely defending himself?
No, he wasn't.
Welcome to Casual Academy MMA, your deep dive into MMA history, fight by fight. Let's get it all!
Tonight, we hopped in the MMA time machine for UFC 7.5, December 16th, 1995 in Denver, Colorado for the Ultimate. So if you guys joined us last time in the brawl in Buffalo, you will remember that Marco Ruas defeated the polar bear, the giant, Paul Varelans.
Fight number one, we have our boy Tank Abbott versus Steve Jennum. Tank submits him with a neck crank with his own head. Yeah.
They come to the center. Tank throws. Steve Jennum rolls with it. Tank gets him to the ground, gets him up against the fence. And Steve Jennum's showing like a little jiu-jitsu there. He kicks Tank in the face from the ground. He kind of spins out, recovers guard. Somehow Tank winds up on top of him. Tank is essentially running the top of his head into Steve Jennum's face and pushing it with everything he's got into the fence. Steve Jennum's face looks like it's about to fall off his body.
Yeah, dude. His chin was like touching his shoulder. Like, it was like...
Tank Abbott wins, defeats the former champion Steve Jennum with a neck crank.
Fight number two, we have Paul Varelans versus Dan the Beast Severn. Dan couldn't have made it look easier if he tried. I mean, it got the takedown, immediately went into side control, and got the first arm triangle in the UFC. So shout out to him for that.
Dude, it's funny because there's this, we keep saying, oh, Dan's bigger than everybody. Yeah. Paul Varelans is bigger than everyone. And if there's one thing we remember from Paul Varelans before is Paul Varelans has heart. There was not really a lot to this fight, but it does settle the fact that Dan is not just the biggest guy.
Fight number three, Dave Benetau versus Oleg Taktarov.
This fight, they basically circled, met in the middle, grappled for a little bit. Oleg drops down.
Oh, he went for that a lot in this whole event. Mm-hmm. Yeah, he
drops down for the heel hook, ankle lock. I don't know exactly. Gets it. There was a little bit of fighting back and forth on the ground for maybe 25 seconds max. And then Oleg gets it. Pretty easy victory. He moves on to the semifinals.
Yeah.
It almost seems like Oleg is going to beat anyone who's not, he's like kind of a modern day gatekeeper,
Fight number four, the last quarterfinal match, we have Keith Hackney versus Marco Ruas. 30 seconds in, I was like, oh, we're going to get a stand-up battle for the first time.
Keith Hackney throws like a wild overhand right. That's when Ruas ducks under, gets his back standing up, drags him down, hooks in, rolls him to his stomach, flattens him out, drops bombs, and it's pretty much, like you said, over.
The most impressive performance, in my opinion, up to this point. Tank Abbott versus Dan Severn. And dude, I was hyped for this fight. I don't know about you, but I was so hyped for this fight. Nothing burger, bro. This was a nothing. I mean, Dan just did whatever the fuck he wanted.
This was fucking terrible.
It was, the most one-sided fight
ever.
Yeah.
At one point in time, Dan is grabbing the fence, using it for leverage, and just dropping knees from outer space onto Tank's head, onto Tank's shoulders, onto Tank's arms, onto Tank's side.
12 to 6 elbows to the back of the head and the neck, repeatedly.
Yeah. I mean, just brutal, horrendous beatdown. Probably the only fight John McCain saw before making his decision. Tank
2 hands
was holding
on the cage.
onto the cage for dear life, throwing elbows back at Dan. Nothing doing. Didn't do anything. Too little, too late. But in the last literally 10 seconds, either Dan got up. I think Dan got up and Tank chased him and I don't want to say was swinging for the fences, but let's just say swung for the fences once, fell, and the fight was over.
Yeah. Shout out to that fight, though, being the first decision in UFC. The next fight for the second semifinal is Oleg Taktarov versus Marco Ruas.
The one thing you can say about Oleg is this motherfucker has no quit in him.
Not at all. Not at all. I'd say biggest like dog in the UFC. No, but this fight was kind of quote controversial because
plain and simple, you thought
I thought Ruas won.
I thought Oleg won,
but all the judges sided with Oleg,
and then so did. And I see why you thought Oleg. I see why you think Ruas won. Ruas stuffed a bunch of takedowns,
right?
Stopped a few submissions, and was landing some pretty good leg kicks. On my side of the equation, I feel like Oleg was the aggressor. Cannot deny that. Oleg was the one throwing. The few punches that were thrown were from Oleg. Oleg dropped down for the heel hook, went for multiple submissions, even had a guillotine what felt like locked in at one point.
You know, which is so interesting because Ken said on the commentating, he was like, or on his little interview, he was like, oh, you give that 2 points to Oleg. The way I see it is if you don't get that submission, you don't get, like, I don't know, maybe that could be my bias to like newer UFC rules, but you don't get points for trying to sink in a submission, in my opinion.
I feel like if it's a half-ass attempt, you might not. But if you're like close, like, well,
but he didn't get it.
Bring it to the modern UFC. What if the bell rang? What if he had him in that guillotine and the bell rang?
It's just damage.
He was in that guillotine for fucking 7.5 minutes. It felt like.
Right.
You know, Big John stood the fight up. So.
Stupidly stood the fight up when it was like he was like work when Oleg had a pretty good guillotine in and he stood the fight up. But anyway, Oleg wins the unanimous decision.
Yeah.
And now I guess you could say he's the reigning champion because he beat the former champion.
And he had the belt. Oleg seems to be the guy that's like trying shit. He was trying heel hooks. He was the guillotine killer in the last one.
I was about to say that. He switched from the guillotine being his thing to now the heel hook. Well, the final of the fight is Dan Severn versus Oleg Taktarov, right? They both were in like long-winded fights. So you have Dan going 20 minutes and then you have Oleg going 20 minutes. The problem is Dan had 20 minutes of rest. And then you got Oleg coming straight off of that fight right into the finals.
Yeah. I mean, Oleg was barely standing, but he was rough after 20 minutes of fighting Hua.
Yeah.
In a close fight, which theoretically could have gone to either guy.
Yeah. So Dan came out and just kind of fucked him up.
Yeah.
Pretty bad.
Yeah.
You know, we were talking about the most one-sided fight. This could be kind of close to that.
This was pretty close to it. This one was a lot more brutal because Oleg was going for things. He wasn't just defending.
Exactly, yeah. And the headbutts. For some reason, Dan didn't headbutt Tank. Maybe he thought he would lose that battle.
Yeah.
But he was headbutting the life out of Oleg.
Yeah.
I mean...
And they were short, super in tight headbutts. They weren't like... He wasn't like lifting up and dropping. He was just in his face, just dropping.
I mean, there was one point where he had his hand... on his like neck and his face, pushing him down while he just headbutted him over and over. That's crazy.
Nate Diaz, eat your heart out.
Yeah, for real.
Dan Severn was slapping the fuck out of Oleg Taktarov. Slapping him from every direction. He was even slapping down, like slapping the top of his head.
I think he didn't want to break his hand or hurt his hand.
For sure, because you got to remember they don't have gloves.
Right.
They can if they want, but they don't. One-sided beatdown. Dan was just too big. He was just on top of Oleg. At one point in time, early in the fight, you can tell Oleg really went for it because Oleg dropped down, really nice drop down for this heel hook and almost had it, but Dan scrambled out. Dan was just too big, too fast. Dan is an athlete. Dan does have good cardio. Dan is massive. He's strong and he's quick. He just scrambled out of stuff and wound up in top position too many times and just was ground and pounding him, and that is very simply it, other than the one moment where Oleg literally climbed up the fence and Dan and looked like he, like you said, he was trying to jump out of the fucking fence. I think his corner would have let him die. Think about it, dude. At what point in time was he even remotely defending himself?
No, he wasn't. I'm telling you, he like after they stood it up for sudden death, his face looked rearranged. Like he looked like a zombie of a person.
Yeah. So that was it, man. UFC 7.5 Ultimate. An unimpressive showing from Tank Abbott outside of his first fight, and the champion is once again Dan the Beast Severn.
Very impressive. Very impressive showing from Dan Severn.
Yeah, he's an athlete. He's a big guy. Most impressively, it wasn't just his size because he absolutely mauled Paul Varelans, who is much bigger than him. Yeah, if you get an opportunity and you want to see some like really weird early UFC shit, look at Tank Abbott's neck crank submission victory over Steve Jennum. It is just the stuff that this early UFC is made of.
Yeah, it's like kill or be killed. I feel like
it really is.
It's just like either you're getting fucked up or you're fucking somebody else up. There's not a lot of like wars back and forth.
Very few sweeps.
Yeah.
Very few like if you start winning, you're probably going to win.
Mm-hmm.
But tonight was the ultimate. Thanks for joining, and we will see you guys next time.
Peace.
Cool.
That's pretty good.
That was good, man. That was a good kind of low key.